Yes, and there's another piece of news that's happened, I think, since your forecast last Thursday, which, of course, is the announcement from Pfizer and BioNTech that they've been successful in their phase 3 trials for a vaccine for coronavirus. Can you just fill us in on how this would affect your outlook for the economy in the months ahead?
Yes. So first of all, I mean, it's obviously encouraging news. I mean, it's encouraging for all individuals, it's encouraging for businesses, and it's encouraging for the economy. Probably worth starting by just putting a bit of perspective on what we assumed as the sort of backdrop to the forecast. We obviously don't make any sort of precise forecast about when any particular medical intervention, medical improvement is going to take place. But what we did have in the forecast was a sort of conditioning assumption that after the end of the first quarter next year, i.e. after the end of the winter really, there would be a sort of gradual and progressive improvement in conditions, which would reflect a gradual advance of, if you like, of treatment and vaccines. We made no assumption about some waterfall or moment when a vaccine came on stream. So, I mean, I think the news is encouraging. I'm not saying, I think like many of the other and many of the much more expert responses than I would give, I think we have to be cautious because obviously there's still quite a way to go in terms of the trialling. And there's obviously then the question of production and distribution and actually getting it obviously into action. So I think it's, first of all, it is broadly consistent with the way in which we condition the forecast. But it is very encouraging because it's the first, in a sense, it's the first very sort of encouraging piece of news that we can put greater confidence in that. And that has the other really beneficial effect that it reduces the huge level of uncertainty that we have, obviously, in the forecast at the moment. So that starts to see a way to reduce that uncertainty.
And what about the longer term? Because you've got an assumption in your forecast that in the longer term, there's quite a bit of scarring. So long-term the economy, almost 2%, which is £1 billion, so quite big money. Does the vaccine mean that the amount of change that we might think the economy has to go through isn't as large as maybe you feared?
Well, that's a really interesting question. So let me say two things on that. Let me just start by saying our level of scarring is quite a bit lower than many other forecasts. And why is that? Well, I think one reason I would give, and I don't give this to criticize other forecasts, it's hugely uncertain. But we did spend quite a lot of time in this forecast round looking at sort of, what is a way to, in a sense, think through the economics of the scarring assumptions. Now, I think one thing for me anyway, that we came to and concluded is that looking at history is obviously useful and important, but it's easy to actually take history rather literally and actually come up with rather large figures for scarring in this situation. Let me explain why. Some of the largest figures in history for scarring come from the 1980s and 1990s. And if you extrapolate those figures, I think you get bigger figures than we had. On the other hand, what we saw in the 1980s and 90s was a very obviously pronounced and sharp shift between sectors. So essentially we saw the decline of heavy manufacturing, heavy industry, coal mining, and the shift into a service economy. And that created larger capital scrapping. It created larger structural unemployment, which went on for longer. In this situation, our view is that what we will see in terms of scarring, if it does come to pass, and I'll come on to the vaccine in a moment, is probably more within sector, more within services. So we did take the view that if you take the logic of that sort of train, then it probably suggests that more capital is probably redeployable, and while there would be retraining needs and obviously sort of so-called mismatch unemployment, it might be rather lesser in scale and impact. Now, I think the vaccine is positive. The earlier a vaccine comes on, in a sense, comes into effect, the more positive that is. Though I would caution that we were at the positive end to start with, so just caution in terms of our forecast. But I think there's two reasons for why it would be positive. One, obviously, the sooner that way out of COVID comes into effect, the more businesses are likely to survive in financial terms. So those businesses that would find that they just couldn't survive obviously the shorter the duration of this of the COVID period, the fewer there will be. I think the second one, and this is much harder to really form a view on, is to what extent will there be lasting changes in the way, in the sort of the structure of the economy, so the way people work, where we buy things, and so on. Now, my guess is that I think we will still see changes, and there will be effects, but it's not unreasonable to think that the shorter the duration of the COVID period, possibly the more muted those effects would be. But that's all pretty tentative, Chris, to be honest with you.